Harry, we know perfectly well that the chapter numbers in Thessalonians have nothing to do with anything Paul ever had in mind. But it does look as if at the end of our last discussion, at the end of his fourth chapter, he's said what he has to say about the second coming of Jesus and the order in which people are raised and encouraging one another in the time of hope. And now here we are once again, really, with another eschatological paragraph. What's going on?
Mm-hmm. Well, in some ways, I think Paul may be anticipating the issue, or one of the issues that we're going to be confronting in 2 Thessalonians. He certainly has a strong eschatological hope, and we talked about that both as a historical fact and as a theological issue last time. But he also, I think, knows that he does not know when the eschaton is going to come. Mm-hmm. And this is something that we see in other eschatological discourse in the New Testament. A warning to people not to count the days and seasons and hours and to try to anticipate exactly when things are going to happen. It's all in God's hands. So this is really the point that he wants to make here, to sort of balance the point that he just made, which emphasizes very strongly the possibility that it might happen even in his lifetime.
Yes.
But he knows that he doesn't know. That's always a good thing, to know when you don't know.
It's lovely to know what you don't know.
So that's what the point that he makes here. In fact, what we have in chapter 5, what we now call chapter 5, is kind of a balance of what we had in chapter 4. There, in chapter 4, Paul had talked about ethical issues, holiness and blamelessness, focused on largely matters of sex in the beginning, and then the eschatology at the end. And now he does some further eschatological reflection, balancing the image of the parousia in chapter 4, and then he'll go back to some admonitions at the end.
So in a way, he is doing a kind of cautionary note on what he's just said, right?
That's right.
We live in hope, but we can't specify that too directly. Mm-hmm. Don't take this as permission to kind of start working out all the signs of the times.
Right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So there's traditional language in here. Two places that strike me. Day of the Lord, that's not unique to Paul.
No, the language that we get here is much more common in lots of eschatological discourse in both the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. The day of the Lord is something that we get in the prophets, in Isaiah and Ezekiel and Joel. Some of that material is cited in the New Testament.
Right.
The prophets had the notion that God was going to intervene in human history and set things right, to remedy the wrongs that under which Israel was suffering, and they used the day of the Lord to talk about that hope. They weren't necessarily talking about in fact, they probably weren't talking about an end time utter transformation of things, but they were talking about a point where God would intervene in human history. That language of day of the Lord, as it's appropriated in the New Testament, comes to be focused on God's intervention in the second coming of Christ to render judgment on good and evil.
Right.
The kind of scenario we get in places like Matthew's great assize in Matthew 25.
Right.
But Paul certainly knows that language, uses it in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, and it gives expression to his eschatological hope that God will be intervening and setting things right.
And what about the thief in the night? That looks familiar too.
Yeah, that's an image that pops up in Matthew 24, where the householder is... it needs to be careful because a thief in the night might come, and this is used as a warning to think about paying attention, being awake, and the like. So this is, again, a traditional image that pops up in eschatological discourse. A lot of things here have resonance in Gospel of Matthew or Gospel of Mark, Mark 13 or Matthew 24, or Luke 17 and 22. The notion that there's peace and security. This is a kind of phrase that goes back all the way to the prophets, to Jeremiah, but is picked up in a New Testament text and as a way of referring to a false hope that things are going to be secure. And you can't be certain, I think Paul says, and that's one of the main messages of this little bit of eschatological reflection. Another bit of language that's common in eschatological or apocalyptic passages. The woman in labor. We get that in the eschatological discourse of Jesus, and it's picked up in places like John 16, and used in slightly different ways in each case, right? But it's an image that can be deployed for talking about end-time events. And so Paul does so here in a way that it's commonly used, that is, there's no escape. Once you're in labor, it's going to happen. Right. But you don't know when.
Right. Well, let me say two things about that. First of all, as I hear you, it sounds to me as if there was a kind of open-ended treasure house of images and sayings that could be drawn on by early Christian preachers, writers, letter writers, parable tellers, so that it doesn't necessarily mean that Paul is quoting Matthew. It means, on the contrary, but it means that there was a kind of images that were part of the common Christian language that he could draw upon, and Matthew could draw upon, and John could draw upon.
Yeah, there's some speculation that Paul might have known something like Mark 13. And we don't know exactly when the Gospel of Mark was written.
Right.
Some people date it right before the revolt of the Jews against Rome in 70. Some people have speculated it might be earlier. So it's or parts of it might be earlier.
Yeah.
And especially that eschatological discourse that seems to refer to, perhaps as an event in the immediate past, the attempt by the Roman Emperor Caligula to have a statue of himself set up in the Temple of Rome, which took place around 40.
Right.
So if the eschatological discourse in Mark was a set piece that Mark then incorporated, some of these images might well have been out there, not only in the general store of things, but also in a literary form.
Written down somewhere. Yeah, okay,
and,
that's helpful.
Paul might have had access to something like that, but he's not quoting a text.
No, right. Well, I think implicitly you've already suggested that Paul and certainly Mark and Matthew want to caution against any kind of clear sense of these are the three signs you have to look for, and now let's check the papers and look at that. Israel's doing the following, or Russia's doing the following. What do you say about the understandable desire of Christians in our time to say, okay, here's sign one, here's sign two, and now we know exactly where we are in God's timeline?
Right. This is an attitude or an approach especially associated with dispensationalist traditions, and probably popularized by things like Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth, and other literature of that sort. And it's an impulse that goes back in some ways to the early stages of the apocalyptic tradition. You get it in the book of Daniel, which has a calculation of when God is going to intervene to set things right with Israel in his day. Yeah. And he bases that calculation on a reading of Jeremiah and Jeremiah's prophecy of 70 years between the destruction of the first temple and the building of the new.
Right.
And sure enough, the second temple was authorized at least before the end of that 70-year period, thereby gaining Jeremiah fame and fortune as a prophet.
Considerable credibility, yes.
But what Daniel does is to say, that's not 70 years, it's 70 weeks of years. And we're in the middle of the last week. And he calculates and calculates, and apparently gets it wrong, because the last paragraphs of Daniel have recalculations.
Right.
But in any case, the temple was restored within a period of time close to what Daniel was predicting, and that then led to lots of speculation about whether one could do that with other prophecies. Book of Revelation plays with this, and plays with the text in Daniel. But certainly it's been picked up in some modern Christian circles. And I think those who attempted to go in that direction probably need to read this passage.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Last thing on the apocalyptic before we get to kind of the admonitions at the end of the letter. It strikes me how many different images Paul piles together here when he talks about the faithful response to the coming Lord. Sleeping, drinking, light, darkness, helmets, breastplates. He's on a kind of metaphorical roll here.
Yeah, well, there seems to be kind of a process of association going on, right? So we have the thief in the night, and then that leads to night and darkness, and darkness versus light.
Right, and then drunkenness.
Right. Yeah. So, it really is interesting to watch him work in this way. Yeah, the next image that he deploys there in this eschatological section is children of light. And this evokes images like that of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where the children of darkness are versus the children of light. And that's language that gets picked up in the New Testament. Luke has it. Luke 16:8 talks about the children of light. So again, it's part of what you refer to as the grand eschatological store of images. And Paul just does a process of association here and builds his little discourse in that way.
It's powerful in its own way, I think.
And then it's interesting. So you get darkness, light, and darkness is a feature of night. Night is when you sleep, so stay awake.
Right, stay awake. Right.
It's interesting to see how Paul works with antitheses. He does this a lot in some other places. 2 Corinthians in particular is built on a whole series of antitheses in chapters 2 through 5. So that's the way his mind works, association and antithesis.
Okay. So now we come to the final exhortations and admonitions. Let me just start with the first question, which is, he says in verse 12 of chapter 5, "We appeal to you, brothers and sisters, to respect those who labor among you and have charge of you in the Lord." And then later on he talks about, do not despise the words of the prophets. Are there kind of guilds of prophets, or do we have bishops and preachers on the way, or what's happening in this very early letter? Probably the first Christian letter.
I think we sometimes have an image of early Christianity as an idyllic socialist community where everybody is equal and no one is in charge. I think a fact of human existence is that where two or three are together, one of them is going to be in charge.
Chair the committee, yes.
So,
thank you, Mr. Dean.
So there are people who've assumed some sort of responsibilities here.
Yeah.
And Paul recognizes this in places like 1 Corinthians 12, where he has that image of the body of Christ, and the different members do different things, and some of them are more respectable than others, and then he maps that onto ecclesial functions like prophesying and teaching and healing, etc. The old distinction between charismatic and other kinds of authority that we get from Weber probably obtains here. I think people stepped up to the plate to do different kinds of things. But someone had to chair the meetings, someone had to take the notes, someone had to open his or her house to the meetings of the community, and these people are in leadership roles. We don't yet have an authoritative structure with either formally ordained elders or bishops and deacons. We will before too very long. By the end of the first century, we'll have both of those forms of ecclesiastical organization in operation. But here we do have people who are assuming some sort of roles. Prophets, by the way, I think Paul basically explains that in 1 Corinthians 14. Where he contrasts speaking in tongues with prophecy, and prophecy is a word that's intelligible.
Right.
So I think a prophet is basically a preacher.
More like a preacher, right? Yeah. I keep hoping. Then I want to come back to the way he signs up, but it strikes me that he says in verse 27, "I solemnly command you by the Lord that this letter be read to all of them." It's a quick reminder to us that it was not 45 Christians in Thessaloniki, each with a copy of this text reading it, but that the texts were sent to readers within the congregation, so that the vast majority of early Thessalonian Christians would have been hearing it, not reading it. That it's an oral
whether or not they could read.
That's a
matter of some debate, how extensive literacy was.
Presentation would have been oral. All right, just finally, the holy kiss. What's a holy kiss, and why is it dropped out of our liturgies?
Well, it's there in some liturgies in a kind of muted fashion. I think what we're talking about here is basically a form of ordinary greeting that would have been practiced in Paul's day in all sorts of communities, where people kiss one another on their cheeks. It's practiced today.
In the Arab world today, sure.
Yeah, in the Arab world and the French world. It's common enough in different societies. But this is done between members of a community that's holy, and that makes it so.
Right.
So I think it's the greeting of people within this fellowship, within the body of Christ, and the fact that they do it there is what gives it its particular character. And sure enough, it's not at this point a ritual in a Eucharistic assembly. It's the way these people do
Yeah.
it. But it did become some form of ritualized greeting did become a part of Christian liturgy later on, and at least in the Catholic tradition, was revived after the Second Vatican Council in the form of a handshake,
Right,
but in
absolutely,
a
right.
passing of the peace.
Yeah.
We get that in a lot of different Christian traditions, right?
we do.
And that's the contemporary version of a holy kiss, but that's where it begins.
Okay, thank you, sir.